I think that community engagement is one of our pathways for rebuilding trust in science. And so it's just important to say that. And that should be all of our jobs right now.
I'd like to welcome everyone to another episode of Inside the Scholar's Journey. This is our podcast that's sponsored by the Wright Center, the Wright Talk. Today, we have an opportunity to talk about a topic that is very, very timely and very relevant. That is of community-engaged research. My name is Pat Nana-Sinkam. I'm Associate Director of the Wright Center and also serve as a professor of pulmonary and critical care medicine.
I'm Gretchen Neigh. I'm a professor in neuroscience and anatomy and also director of education and mentoring for the Wright Center. Really excited to be here today to welcome Alex and Leah to talk about community engaged research.
Absolutely. So we really do want to welcome Leah Gregory and Alex Krist. They are two of our resident experts and have really dedicated much of their careers to this area of research, which, as I mentioned, is so relevant to the mission of our institution, and that is really serving our community and bringing innovation and research, importantly, to our community. So Leah Gregory has a master's in public health as well as a master's in social work, and she's the community and collaboration program manager at the Wright Center of Clinical and Translational Research since 2023. She has over 17 years of experience working in the social work field, has been doing community-based research with the VCU Center on Society and Health for 10 years, as a part of the engaging Richmond community research team. Leah has also experienced working directly with individuals and communities from diverse backgrounds, managing grants for the Virginia Department of Health, as well as working collaboratively with many different research teams. She has shared with us that the most rewarding part of her job is building relationships and partnerships with different communities across Virginia and amplifying community voice in research. Leah, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Pat.
Our other guest is someone that I've had the pleasure of working with for many years now, and that is Dr. Alex Krist. Alex is an M.D. as well as an M.P.H. and professor of family medicine at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, but importantly is a practicing family physician and teacher at the Fairfax Family Practice Residency, where he's trained over 250 family physicians. He's co-director of ACORN, which is the Virginia Ambulatory Care Outcomes Research Network, a collection of over 500 primary care practices that collaborate to do research that matters to primary care. And he also serves as co-director of community engagement for the Wright Center for Clinical and Translational Research. Through these activities, Alex has really led multiple projects with community partners with the goal of strengthening primary care delivery, expanding access to care, improving the quality of care, improving health outcomes, evaluating new cancer screening tests, and conducting pragmatic trials that inform everyday primary care practice. Alex, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me here today, Pat.
So I think a great place for us to start is to maybe level set a bit for our audience. When we refer to community engaged research, we're not actually talking about traditional research where the community just serves as a source of data. We're really talking about this spectrum that ranges from consultation all the way to full co-production, where the community members are equally partners in shaping the questions, the methods, and the solutions. So Alex, I'm going to ask you this question. For an early career researcher, what is really the biggest mental shift that's required to move from traditional research to this collaborative model of community engaged research?
Yeah, so we often are really trying to do authentic engagement and authentic partnership with our community members, and it results in that full co-production, as you said. I think the biggest mental shift is really flipping the paradigm. So instead of asking, like, how can the community help me do my research, we're thinking about how can my research help the community to solve the problems that they care about. And it might sound like a subtle difference, but it really changes most everything across the whole research spectrum. It changes how you build relationships. It changes how you define success. It even changes potentially what you choose to study. So if your primary goal is to publish a paper or to get a grant, community engagement might be more transactional. Can you help me with this task or with that task? But if your goal is to improve health and to solve real problems that a community partner is addressing, then the community is just an essential co-collaborator because they understand the local context, they know the priorities, they know the practical realities better than anyone. And it means kind of changing the thought from researchers of being the experts and the folks who are discovering the answers to really this is a co-production. And, the researcher brings scientific methods, analytic tools, they might know the evidence and the literature, but the community brings the lived experience, the knowledge of the local systems, an understanding of what's going to be feasible and what's meaningful. And recognizing that both of those forms of expertise are critical and that combining them together results in research that's really much more rigorous and relevant than you would do otherwise. So, for early investigators, I think a little bit about it's less about recruiting a community into doing research and more about inviting research into the work that communities are already doing. And it's a different mindset to be able to do that, but it results in research that can be really meaningful and impactful for different communities and for health outcomes.
It's really a perfect segue into really trying to understand this difference or the delineation between community-engaged research and community outreach. So, Leah, I wonder from your perspective, how do you draw that line between what people see as standard recruitment and outreach and true community engaged research? Because at the end of the day, they are slightly different, but I think there's that misconception that persists, particularly among the uninitiated or the early career investigators. And how do you help them understand the difference?
Absolutely. Yeah. And you say slightly different, but I'd say very different, especially when we're talking about kind of this spectrum of community engagement of, how it kind of from, one end of the spectrum, right, that kind of talks about just like standard recruitment or outreach all the way up to, authentic community engagement, empowerment, things like that. And so, talking about this first side of like outreach and recruitment, I like to think about it in terms of, I guess, how is that relationship helping each other, right? Or what is the nature of the relationship? So with outreach, I think that it is just the researcher, right, or the provider kind of providing a service or information, right? Maybe we're just giving out information, or maybe we're just giving out a service, be that a clinical trial, be that, participation in research. We might be asking some questions about the research, how to recruit people, things like that. But that's about where that relationship ends, right? And it's kind of one-sided, right? But when we talk about authentic communication, right? And collaboration on the other end of that spectrum, it's kind of that cyclical symbiotic relationship, right? Where we talk about, that Alex kind of alluded to, where we're going into the community, we're asking, okay, what is the problem that you are seeing? And how can we integrate what the knowledge and skills that we have into the daily work that you do to help you solve that problem, right? Because you are the expert and you have those skills and knowledge to solve that problem with maybe some outside support that we can help, right? And so another factor in two of those different things is time, and really carving out the time to be able to do that authentically, and the time to put into those activities is very, very vital and very important to doing this work. So I like to think or encourage early researchers to really identify their timeline, their time schedule, and really be intentional about, okay, if I want to do this, I know that it'll take the time and I know it'll take extra resources to really do this correctly.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Leah.
Actually, thinking about time and the amount of time that really needs to be invested to do this well, to really bidirectionally engage with the community, it brings to mind some of the academic struggles that also have to be balanced against that. So, Alex, when you are advising a postdoc or an assistant professor that's considering participating in community engaged research, but they also have to be productive and they're working towards grant funding and tenure and things of that nature, what are some things that you can offer them, some suggestions you can offer them to help them engage authentically and dedicate the time that is necessary, but still be able to make the progress necessary for them to be able to contribute long term.
Yeah, Leah said it right. Building relationships. I mean, it takes time. It takes time and effort, and it takes resources, and it's a very real challenge. And we shouldn't pretend that it's not. And it's particularly a challenge for an early career investigator who, they also have to establish themselves. They have to have results. They have to have papers. They need grants and thinking about promotion and other things. I think one of the big suggestions I would have is to not try to build everything from scratch. Finding a mentor or a team or infrastructure or resources that are already there, that are working with the communities that you want to be working with is a great resource to try and tap into. So if you think on the basic science level, like you wouldn't think about building a new laboratory before you knew how to do molecular biology. And we wouldn't really create a new community partnership before learning how to do community engaged research. So, these are things that need to kind of be co-developed. Another strategy actually that I think also helps. So let's say that you want to have a community partnership with a community that there aren't people working with, and it really will require a new partnership. I like to think of people that we call spanners, people with feet in two different worlds. So as a family physician and primary care researcher, one of the things that helps me a lot is I work with many of the doctors and nurse practitioners in different communities, and they are viewed as a trusted resource in that community. And then as a family physician, I can be viewed as a trusted resource to them. So it creates this nice spanning relationship where you can expand your reach through trusted partners that you're also building the trusted relationship with. And thinking about developing that trusted relationship is going to be an important message that you'll hear throughout here. I'll also say that I think institutions, universities have a responsibility here. So if we're going to tell people that community engagement is important, we have to give them the time and the resources and the ability to do it. And if we value community engaged research, we need to recognize that developing enduring partnerships, that's scholarly work in of itself, in addition to the papers, in addition to the grants and the papers. And that can actually improve health and outcomes and the things that we're trying to do just by itself. So all of these together are different things to be thinking about to make it a little bit easier to do some of this hard work.
Yeah, thank you. Extending the scope of community engagement just a little bit further, well, clinical or social science researchers have a really clear connection points with the community. Bench scientists often work entirely within a lab, and although their motivation is that at some point in the future they want their work to benefit the community, it's many more steps removed. How can a basic or discovery phase scientist effectively practice community engagement or awareness or whatever the right context might be? And what are some concrete steps that you could suggest that they can take to build meaningful partnerships and to try to push away the academic silos and get past the highly technical language and other obstacles that make it hard to get out of the lab and really into the community that you're motivated to serve, you're just further removed from?
Yeah, that's a great question, Gretchen. And I think it kind of goes back to what Alex was alluding to as spanners. I kind of call them connectors. So that's kind of folks that are in a role like myself, similar to other folks. We're kind of that liaison between the community, right, and between researchers and the university institution. And that's always a really helpful place to start, because I think when we're talking about, especially the Richmond community is a very small community, and sometimes unintentionally, we're kind of tapping on the same people, on the same organizations, on the same kind of community-facing institutions to ask questions and to get connected, right? But it kind of comes back to us here at the university to kind of build that relationship and kind of see how that relationship can really fit and develop and be supported, rather than just having that person directly contacted and then build a relationship. Because like Alex was saying, a lot of those relationships are already built. They already exist. And I think that the best thing that, an early career kind of researcher can do is kind of see the supports, resources, and infrastructures that are already there. We're actually working on a really big project at VCU called Collaboratory. And what that's going to do is actually kind of demonstrate or show the connections that exist. So who is the researcher doing that research in that community directly with that organization, right? And so what people can do is utilize that resource to be able to identify, oh, okay, so this researcher has done a project with, say, Health Brigade, right? So I know that this relationship exists. Maybe I can talk to this researcher and ask some questions and get some information and feedback, right, before we are kind of just going into the community and overwhelming them, because that's a reality that can happen sometimes. So I would say a tangible step would be to utilize the things that already exist and kind of do your homework ahead of time.
And Gretchen, I'll add a little, thinking of the bench researcher, it's also about making sure you're engaging the right community for the right things, right?
Yeah.
So in family medicine, we'll often have people come to us and say, oh, we want to study this very rare disease. And we know in primary care, you have some of these people with this very rare disease. It's like, well, yeah, but the primary care community is not really the primary audience for that type of work. And so the same applies with bench research. So who's your primary audience? Because that's your community. And then going back to those areas of expertise, what's the area of expertise that you're lacking? And, for a lot of us in research, it's we don't have the language tools and the lay language to explain why something's important or to understand what are the challenges and the specific issues maybe we should focus on. And so thinking also about what the audience and your community would bring to fill in and supplement and synergize with what you have as expertise. You're not going to ask them about the basic bench science principles. That's not what you're looking to the community members to. It might be more about relevance and communication and focus and some of those issues. So it's a different way of thinking if you're doing more bench research versus public health research.
Yeah, thank you both. That's really helpful. And I think maybe part of what I hear coming through is I really like the spanners and the connectors idea. And that's really helpful. And knowing that you work with your team. So many of us do team science, and that's so essential. But also the authenticity piece, that community engagement, whether you're a bench scientist or truly out in the community doing community engaged research, is not checking a box. And you need to think about authentically, what is the need, not just for you as a scientist, but more importantly for the community, and how can you bring those things together and engage your team to do so? Thank you.
So I heard you both talk about some various strategies that an early career investigator can take when they're setting course to really participate in community engaged research. I heard about mentorship is really important, obviously, and identifying mentors who perhaps have already established relationships in the community, I think is really important. And secondly, I heard just the idea of leveraging resources that are already in place. So not trying to, quote, reinvent the wheel. And those sound like some really good strategies, particularly for an investigator who might be very early on and they haven't necessarily secured the resources. They're coming into this and not being able to, for example, compensate the community members. So recognizing that those are some strategies that early career investigators can take. I want to kind of shift a little bit to the actual community engaged research and how you actually operationalize it, because that's a big question that people are going to ask. And so this is for Alex, what does true co-production research look like at the study design stage? And how can an early career scientist really ensure that it's a collaborative relationship, a truly collaborative relationship, and that the power or the oversight is genuinely shared? And perhaps in that context, you can talk about community advisory boards. We hear a lot about community advisory boards, but really, what are they, and how can you leverage a community advisory board to help in that regard in terms of ensuring that they are involved and the community is truly involved as you design and even execute the study?
Yeah. Well, I think of the true co-production means that you're collaborating with the community across the whole life cycle of the research. Having the study, having the grant, having the idea, coming to the community, saying, this is what we're going to do, tell me if it's right. That doesn't always feel as good, and that's not truly co-production. And I'll be transparent. It's a challenge with research, because even us as researchers, right? We might have the grant we want to do, but we have to write the grant that the RFP, the request for proposals, is about. So there is that balance of how do you get to that true co-production where you're coming up with the research together. And I know that another element that has for us, it's the longitudinality. So, okay, we're working with these communities over time. And so today they might say, well, we want to do this study on this. I might not have a funding mechanism, but I know what's important to them. And so then when the different grants and the things come up, our team can be actually on top of it and jumping in at the beginning with that true co-production. I'd say the third thing around that is just truly listening. So I try to spend a lot of time with, if we're having a meeting with, we'll talk in a second about community advisory board, if I'm talking more than a tenth of the meeting, I've talked way too much. I need to have my mouth shut. I need to be listening and understanding what it is that they're saying. And I need to be able to take what I'm doing and think about that as giving them a voice. And I heard Leah said that about elevating our communities and giving them a voice. And I think that's a really another key part about that co-production. For me, like, I feel like we've succeeded with the co-production if when we're like done with the study, if they're the ones who take everything and run with it and promote it and are talking about it and sharing it, and I don't need to do anything because they're so excited about it, like, that was the win right there. So you'd mentioned community advisory boards. That's sort of one of our processes that we use to have some of those longitudinal relationships and those longitudinal discussions. And we have a number of different advisory boards with different groups. So for example, in Acorn, we have clinicians and care team members and patients that we meet with monthly. And we talk about the things that matter to them. We talk with them about what we're doing. We get advice from them at all the different steps. We figure it out what they want to be, what they're doing, and how can the stuff that we're doing help them with what they're doing. Leah runs our Greater Richmond Advisory Board, and that's kind of a regional one where we're trying to deal with the issues that are important to our metropolitan region in Richmond. And it's the same concept. It's really listening to them, understanding what's important, what they're dealing with the day to day, what types of things they think that research might help them with. And then for us to be able to take that and help to turn that into something that'll make a difference for the communities that we're working with.
That's so helpful, Alex. I've heard you both talk about the importance of authenticity and the importance of listening. And so I think it's a perfect segue into the next question that I have, which is really for both of you. And that is, really, given the current climate where there is some degree of public skepticism around science and medicine, when you're advising early career investigators, those who maybe are very new to the area of community engaged research, can you all each think of maybe one non-negotiable step a researcher really should take when they're thinking about either starting to build the trust, or even repairing trust, particularly if they are engaging a community that perhaps has been historically underrepresented in clinical trials? Are there things that come to mind for each of you that are really non-negotiable? And you say, okay, these are the initial rules of the road. Let me give you a couple that are either number one, number two, or number three.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And, I think it's really important to acknowledge, not only in Richmond, but, all over the state, kind of the historical context that especially medical research has had on different communities, right? Black communities, Indigenous communities, other communities of color, really intentionally. And so acknowledging that, I think, just right off the bat, and doing your homework, understanding that history, and also being open to to have that conversation with the community is one of the things that's helpful, that can start to rebuild some of that harm that was done. So for me, that's one of the things that's really, really important. And something that goes hand in hand with that is honesty and transparency, right? Like when we talk about research coming in and kind of the limits of what we can do and what we can't do. Alex was talking about, sometimes we have our long-term cabs, right? When we talk about, hey, this is something that's really important to us. For example, gun violence, right, in communities. And so there might not be a research project that can, has to do with gun violence at this time, right? But saying that to them, right? And explaining, like, unfortunately, this is the pace with which research goes, right? We might put something in and not hear anything back for a year, right? But in the meantime, right, like, what are the steps that we can take? What are the things that we can do? Are there other strategies that we can do, other things that we can work on that will be helpful for you to kind of do your work and move that forward? So, transparency, honesty about the things that you can do. And maybe a third thing is, especially when a project ends, right? So sometimes folks are doing community engaged research and it ends. Really just kind of finishing out the project and kind of closing that gap or that loop in communication and in dissemination. And that can be really, really hard to do because sometimes in a research project, we're doing all the work, we're getting all the data and information that we need, right? But then we haven't planned for like dissemination or like the closeout plan and things like that. And those are very, very important, to really like close out a relationship and kind of leave a better taste and, in communities and with that relationship. So, I think that those three things are really, really important when working with communities.
Right. Thank you. Alex, some non-negotiables from your perspective.
Well, I'll say right up front, Pat, with your question about the mistrust in science, it's actually one of the reasons we need community engagement. I think that community engagement is one of our pathways for rebuilding trust in science. And so it's just important to say that. And that should be all of our jobs right now. We need to restore trust in science. I think the three things Leah said are spot on. I'll add one other one, which is showing up and being there. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by showing up and being there is a lot. Okay, it sounds simple, but I actually mean a lot with it. It might mean getting in the car and being in the communities. In primary care and practice-based research network, we talk about blue highways and we do have virtual meetings, which is great, and it can bridge divides and everything. But there is something about being there and showing up in a community to show that you care about what's happening there. And by the showing up, it also can mean that act of listening, having the regular meetings and prioritizing the meetings, that creating the structure for the honest discussions to have, that can be part of showing up. And another part of showing up, Leah mentioned at the end of a study, conveying results. It's also not like abandoning the community at the end of the study, right? So we often will create community partnerships for a study. And that always scares me a little bit because, it is this helicopter idea. We're going to come in, we're going to do our stuff, and then we're going to leave. So the showing up is a way that you really show longitudinally, I care about this community. I want the outcomes and the problems and the things that you all are dealing with to be better than they are over time. And so showing up encompasses a lot of different things to demonstrate that you do care and you're committed to the work that you're doing, making a difference. I think that's a pathway to earn that trust.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you both.
We're in a time of rapid change with the growth of generative AI and many more digital tools coming on the scene very quickly. And these could be tremendous opportunities, but I can imagine also risks for community engagement. So I'm curious about your thoughts about how these new tools can be positively interwoven with ongoing community engagement efforts. And and how it could potentially lead to broader engagement of larger communities we might not be able to access by just being there, although that certainly would be ideal. It's not always possible. And what suggestions you would give to maybe a tech-savvy postdoc or assistant professor that's gung-ho with like implementing these new AI tools and opportunities, how they can do that without losing that authentic relationship?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, as we talk about new tools and I think sometimes when you think about community engagement, you think about being there and being in person and relationship building, and being there, right? Like getting in the car and driving to the location. But it's very interesting. When I first started my career as a community engaged researcher, it did mean those things, right? It did mean me living in Richmond and going to the East End community. And we did have meetings in person every week. And that's how people saw us, right? They saw us like physically there. They felt comfortable with engaging in our research projects, asking our questions, attending our focus groups, right? That was kind of the way that was done. So kind of fast forward to 2020 and COVID, a lot of those things shifted, right? Like we couldn't be in spaces together. And so when I started this role in 2023, I think that I'd say like 90% of research projects meetings have been virtual. And I think that a couple of reasons why we have had such great, collaboration and participation in those spaces is consistency and also, the engagement of the folks and the work that we're doing. And so we have a couple of different projects right now. One that comes to mind is a research project that I'm working with Dr. Emily Zimmerman on. And it's a kind of an advisory board, long-term advisory board over a 3-year time span. And it's folks with lived experience with substance use. And so we have been meeting every other week for about 1.5 years now, and we have great attendance every single meeting. And that is because of our ability to engage them, allow them to make decisions about what our topics are going to be. So all sorts of topics that have to do with substance use. So housing issues, things like medically assisted treatments for substance use, like all these different topics that they really have their hands in to make a decision about. And they just come back every single week to meetings. And really having that great participation. So it's the consistency, it's the engagement that really shines with that participation. So I think that kind of like in the future, like it can be done, but it has to be done well. And you have to kind of have a lot of these, keep a lot of these things that we're suggesting in mind. But you can have successful community engagement virtually, because we've been doing it for the last, 6 years? So. Yeah.
And I'll add to what Leah's saying. There's the technology and the virtual meetings that has been pretty transformative. We did a study in primary care practices and with 76 practices across the state, and we were able to reach across the whole state. And actually, at the end of the study, for fun, we figured out the amount of CO2 we would have released by driving to all the practices, and it was equal to 160 acres of Amazon rainforest that we saved. So that was good, right?
Yeah.
That saves a lot. But thinking about the other end of it too, what you were talking about, Gretchen, in the future of technology, things like AI, you hinted at it, like AI can't replace a relationship. So you can't take an AI bot and build a relationship with the community. I don't think that's going to work. Mm-hmm. I do think there's like a ton of work around AI. Like it's such a new field right now. And I think community engagement is going to be a critical element to figure out, well, how does AI fit into our life? Like understanding what different communities and different people think and want from AI, that's going to actually help a lot with how AI is designed and implemented around research, whether the AI is the intervention or a component or other things. And I could imagine a way that AI could really novelly be used to augment relationships. So, Leah and I talk about meeting with lots of folks. Is there a way that AI could make it easier for the community's voices to be elevated? We talk about our working hard to elevate people's voices so that their views and their problems are reflected in research, and research addresses what matters to them, and it's done in a way that matters to them. There may be some ways that AI might be able to help get at some of this. Augmenting the relationship bit, augmenting the bit of showing up, of being there, of being trusted, of the longitudinality and all those other factors. I think that's something we have to learn from right now. And I haven't seen a lot about it being used as part of a community engagement process. But certainly community engagement is needed to understand any AI intervention right now.
Excellent points. Thank you.
Do either of you see a potential role for AI in terms of communicating with communities that are really hard to reach communities? We talk about communities that maybe are in very rural areas, and you're trying to get information to them. Are there ways you think potentially that, like you said, Alex, that it can augment a relationship, or at least in some way support the relationship longitudinally, so that those communities that need to have access to specific information, whether it's in the area of cancer screening or it's in some other area that's really, really important, that it can just serve to maybe complement or supplement, particularly for those communities that are a distance away and are just hard to reach.
I'll even say it's not even just communities that are distant and hard to reach. I mean, we see this in healthcare, right? So there's emerging tools of chatbot therapists, and I can tell you from an evidence standpoint, people are more likely to report some things through the internet or a chatbot than they are likely to tell someone that in person, right? Mm-hmm. So I think there's a number of pathways where it could be helpful. Thinking about if you're talking about or addressing sensitive subjects, that might be another area too. Or if you're dealing with younger people or folks who might be more hesitant to interact with a large group, those could be other things. In rural communities, things like Zoom, I think, work pretty well. And certainly the internet still is sometimes an issue. You need a decent internet for Zoom, but you also need a decent internet if you're going to use an AI tool sometimes. But there may be, I think, that being said, I think there certainly is a pathway as well.
So I want to first thank each of you for taking the time. I mean, this has been absolutely great. And what Gretchen and I would like to do is maybe ask for you to impart upon us a couple of pearls of wisdom. You've given us plenty of wisdom already, and our audience wisdom, but maybe a couple of pearls that really speak to your own reflection on your own sort of career and how you define success. So for both of you, the first question is, if you could go back to the day you finished your training and give yourself one piece of advice about community engagement, what would that piece of advice be? Leah, start with you.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I will say this piece of advice worked out for me because I followed it, and it's kind of got me to where I am now. But I think that it's always important to maintain relationships and partnerships that you've built in the past. So Alex and I have actually known each other a couple of years before I got this role. So with my work in engaging Richmond, I think, Alex, we worked on a couple of projects together. And so from that relationship that we had there, when I was kind of transitioning back into community engaged research, that's how I got into this role and really got to work directly with Alex to move forward. And so, just thinking through community engagement and building those relationships and partnerships is really important to maintain them, especially in Richmond. It's such a small community, and usually there's a smaller number of people kind of doing all the same things. And so building relationships and maintaining those partnerships are super important.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I mean, we've said a lot of the principles that are so important, But I guess one of the other things that we haven't talked about that I think's important is you really have to be adaptive to do community engagement. So you might show up with an idea that this is the study, this is the question, this is what's important, and then to hear that it's not, you have to be able to make a change, right?
Yeah.
And it's not that it wasn't important, and it's not that a lot of it is thinking about how do you blend and adapt these different viewpoints and come up with something that would have been better than if you weren't doing it. And it's just a different way of thinking and approaching things. And that happens at every step, not just coming up with the question, but how you're going to field the study, how you're going to engage people, the language that you should use on recruitment, the dissemination of the results. So to be able to hear, no, that's not the way to do it, think about it this way, or I don't understand what you're talking about, and being able to take that and listen to it and kind of pivot and do something that's better. That takes a little bit of time to get used to.
Yeah.
Leah, Alex, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today and your wisdom and your experiences. And if I could trouble you for just one sentence each to finish us out. In one sentence, what is the ultimate hallmark of a successful community academic partnership?
Yeah, that's great. So I would say kind of a ultimate hallmark of a successful relationship is how we're talked about and how that relationship is talked about in the community. So one of my kind of privileges kind of as a connector or the in-between between both the university and the community is I hear both sides. And so one thing that's really important to me is, how did that relationship work? And after that project or that partnership is not over, but has maybe changed or transitioned, how is that talked about afterwards is really important to me. And if that's positive, then that just kind of speaks to the work that was put in and the relationship that was built. And then it's always helpful too, that we can circle back to that partnership and, maybe do something different or, move work forward even more in community. So.
And as I said earlier, like for a project, if the community that we're working with are the ones that take it up and talk about it after it's done and while it's going on more than I do, I view that as the hallmark. The long term, though, is basically our community partners not breaking up with us, right? So you got that long-term relationship.
Sure.
And if we're doing a good job, we maintain those partnerships and we continue to collaborate and work together. And it goes in cycles depending on the project and what's important and what's available. But we've been very fortunate. We've only had a few community members and communities who've said, I don't want to work with you anymore. And usually it's, a community advisory board member just is busy with their life and work and they don't have the time for it, which it's not we don't like the work you're doing. So as long as our community partners stay engaged and continue to maintain the relationship with us, that's a success to me.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. I want to, on behalf of everyone, I really want to thank you, Leah and Alex, for taking the time. And more importantly, I really want to commend you on the work that you're doing. This is just so vital to giving the care that we want to give to everyone. And the key word is everyone in our community. So I cannot, I think, overstate how important the work is that you're both doing. And we are so very appreciative of you taking the time with us and, again, imparting all of your wisdom. And we sincerely thank you on behalf of the entire Wright Center and also on behalf of the research community as a whole. Thank you so much for really taking the time. We appreciate it. We will see you next time on the Wright Talk Inside the Scholar's Journey. Thanks, everyone. See you next time. Bye.